This is our 6th chapter.
And the name of the 6th chapter is Dhyana Yoga.
Dhyana Yoga.
So we talked about that yesterday. So Dhyana means meditation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is the chapter that goes into great detail about the Ashtanga Yoga, which is the 8-fold yoga system, and also talks about the mind. So go ahead.
So these are the 2 verses that refer to the mind, and in Krishna also talks about mind in many other places throughout this chapter. So we'll use these 2 verses as a hook to understand the mind and how to manage the mind. Uddharedatmanatmanam natmanam avasadayet atmeva hi atmano bandhur atmeva ripuratmanaha. I lost one line. Bandhuratmanatmanatasya yenatmevatmana jitah anatmanastu shatretva vartetatmeva shatruvat.
One must deliver himself with the help of his mind and not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. For him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends, but for one who has failed to do so, his mind will remain the greatest enemy.
So it's very interesting. We'll go deeper into the 5th verse. It uses the word Atma appears so many times in that verse, that one must deliver himself with the help of, if you use the word Sanskrit word, which is Atma, so one must deliver himself with the help of his Atma or Atma and not degrade himself. The Atma is the best friend of the Atma and his enemy as well. So the word Atma has different meanings, and that's why it appears confusing. So this is the mind is a very interesting substance or tattva, because of all the body parts, we actually, I think, refer to the mind the most in any kind of conversations. Or so we were just thinking that if you guys like to take a stab at it, in how many ways do we relate to the mind, or in what ways do we kind of refer to the mind? What are some of the phrases that are in connection with the mind that we commonly use? What is the mind compared to? Mind is compared to so many different things in different cultures, different religions, different traditions. So maybe that would be a good jump start into our mind. Let's see.
Sounds good. Mind over matter.
Mind over matter, yes.
Mind your
business.
Mind your business. Where is your mind? Absent mind.
Out of my mind, yes.
Out of my mind.
Out of sight, out of mind. Come on, guys.
Mind can take you places. Yeah.
Mind can take you places, yes.
I am in 2 minds about it. Very nice, yeah.
2 minds.
2 minds.
Be mindful, yes.
Mind games.
Mind games, yes. Mind your language,
Mind
yes.
your language. My mind is on my money and my money is on my mind. That's nice. Mind your language. I don't mind. Yeah. I don't mind. There must be more. Yeah. Mind is that which connects us.
In Western philosophy, mind is equal to soul, yes.
Yes.
They consider mind to be the soul.
All right.
Okay. So mind is, you'll see that how mind is also compared to a monkey. Mind is compared to...
we'll come to all that.
Depending on who the mind is. Sometimes mind is compared to a cow. Sometimes the mind is compared to an ass. Mind the gap. Yeah. So anyways, so many ways we actually think of the mind. But it's something very incomprehensible in many ways. This is a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam in 11th canto, which actually describes the power of mind. Mind is recognized by Krishna as something very wonderful and very powerful.
I think can we come back to this verse after the
Okay.
So just give us a minute. I think we'll come back to this. Yeah. So first we'll talk about this and then we'll get to that verse. So this is a...
Hey everyone, Jeremy Bennett here.
Go ahead.
Huh? No,
You're going to
nothing.
say,
No, nothing.
Let's look at how powerful your mind is. Let's compare your mind to the most sophisticated man-made device ever created, the computer. The average computer can hold about 250,000 pictures, 20,000
This is
songs,
old computer
and
actually.
hundreds of full-length videos. Nowadays on something the size of my finger. Crazy. But let's compare it to your mind. Your mind can perform an estimated 10 quadrillion operations per second without you even knowing it. Wild. Ask yourself right now, what's making your blood flow throughout your veins with the perfect amount of pressure to keep you alive? What's making your heart beat right now? Are you consciously commanding your heart to beat right now? No. What's maintaining your body core temperature to the perfect degree to keep you alive? What's doing the 6 trillion things to your 60 trillion cells
Oops.
every single second? It's something called your subconscious mind. This is the powerhouse to who you are. Your cat has it, even your puppy has it. But of all the things that your subconscious mind can do, it can't do.
Okay, so we see how this mind has so much power, right? And is there somebody saying something?
Please mute yourself.
Please mute yourself. Yeah. So we can see how this mind is actually a very, very powerful thing. But what exactly, there's so many thoughts that go through our mind. Let's see. There's so many thoughts that go through our mind, and it seems like our mind has a mind of its own. And we don't see it, right? We don't really see our mind, and yet we all know we have a mind. And sometimes we wonder whether this body is actually that is driven by the mind. Just 1 second. Just 1 second.
It's an important reply to this.
Okay.
Mistake.
So we can see. So let's watch this, and we'll discuss about this idea that how.
Look at your hand. How do you know it's really yours? It seems obvious, unless you've experienced the rubber hand illusion. In this experiment, a dummy hand is placed in front of you, and your real hand is hidden behind a screen. Both are simultaneously stroked with a paintbrush. No matter how much you remind yourself the dummy hand isn't yours, you eventually start to feel like it is, and inevitably flinch when it's threatened with a knife. That may just be a temporary trick, but it speaks to a larger truth. Our bodies, the physical, biological parts of us, and our minds, the thinking, conscious aspects, have a complicated, tangled relationship. Which one primarily defines you, or yourself? Are you a physical body that only experiences thoughts and emotions as a result of biochemical interactions in the brain? That would be a body with a mind. Or is there some non-physical part of you that's pulling the strings but could live outside of your biological body? That would be a mind with a body. That takes us to an old question of whether the body and mind are two separate things. In a famous thought experiment.
Yeah, I think we can stop here. So I guess this is actually the million-dollar question, because in the second chapter
16th century philosopher Rene
in the
Descartes.
second chapter of Bhagavad-Gita, we discussed about how we are not this body. And that is a lot easier for us to accept and understand. But we are so tangled up with this mind that is guiding everything. And as we can see here, that in fact, even when something is not us, right, we still have an experience when something happens to that, simply because of projection. And this is something we're going to get into in just a little bit. That is this whole world that we see simply a projection of our mind, right? And so it's a very mysterious thing, and then there are philosophers and scientists who've been trying to figure this out, whether the mind, and of course there is this other thing, which is the mind and the brain. So there's a mind in the body, and then there's a mind in the brain, and what's really going on here, and what is the mind? And so the Bhagavad school actually speaks about the mind as as a separate element, right? So in the future classes discussions we'll talk more about this, but mind is actually a distinct entity, and it's so animated that it sometimes even makes you think that it is conscious, right? So just some questions for you to think about before we get into
Are we not going to that verse, the power of mind?
okay, so yeah, we can now go back to this particular verse, which is from the Srimad Bhagavatam, 11th canto, 23rd chapter, 47th verse. And it says that all the senses have been under the control of the mind since time immemorial, and the mind himself never comes under the sway of any other. He is stronger than the strongest, and his god-like power is fearsome. Therefore, anyone who can bring the mind under control becomes the master of all the senses. So it's a really nice verse, one of verses that has had a lot of impact on me as well, to see that just the word of God-like power, right?
And it is, we come to this material world with our desire to become like God or become God, but at the same time we want to become independent of God. So this is Krishna's kind of trick, in that the mind kind of makes us feel that we are God, but in reality the mind is controlling us all the time, and it has this godlike power. So Krishna has put his godlike powers in the mind so that we can both experience that we are like in control, but at the same time we are being controlled by the mind.
Yeah, and we have such a strong identity, and especially at this point, we are really dealing with this fearsome power of this mind, because there was an article in Time magazine a little while back about how this 21st century, I don't know what is going on. 21st century is all about that how mental health, right, is actually one of our biggest concern right now. And we can see it all around us, how people are really struggling. In fact, this age of Kali Yuga is, one could really say that it's an age of mental health problems, right?
It's the age of the mind degrading.
The mind degrading, quarrel and hypocrisy. And we are seeing that more and more and more. So this is actually a very interesting study that was conducted, I think, by Harvard University, where they said that over 50% of millennials and over 75% of Gen Zers, they're actually leaving their jobs because citing mental health as one of their reasons. So we can watch this.
People are flocking to quit their jobs, but why is that? A new study found that 50% of millennials and 75% of Gen Zers have left a job citing mental health concerns. This is in comparison to just 10% of baby boomers. So I want to ask you, in this study, Dr. Judy, how exactly did they gauge mental health symptoms?
So this is a study that was done by Mindshare Partners and Qualtrics, and they surveyed 1,500 people across a lot of different sectors, including the government sectors, nonprofit, and for-profit. They very intentionally tried to survey across a lot of different types of demographic factors as well to try to get a representative sample.
So it goes on about how people are actually really struggling.
But this is quite surprising, because Gen Zers are like probably in their early 20s, and millennials are also maybe in the late 20s at the most. And for them to develop mental health problems to such an extent that they actually give up the job while they're at the beginning of their career, that's quite shocking actually.
Yeah. And then there is this other study, another chart. This is the breakdown of mental illness, and this is in America. 1 in 5 Americans is affected by mental illness in a given year. 55%, what is this?
Of American adults with a mental health condition received no mental health services in the previous year, as of 2014. An estimated 15% of homeless people staying in shelters live with serious mental illness.
And this was actually quite shocking for me also. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the US. So we see that the mind gives us so much trouble, right? And that is exactly what the Bhagavad-Gita is saying, that the mind can be our best friend or it can be our worst enemy. And at this point, we can see that it is definitely not acting in our interest, and it's creating so many difficulties, right? And I think we've also previously we looked at how so many people struggle in just trying to wake up in the morning and feel motivated. When we were talking about karma yoga, we saw that, and it's a different, just because someone has not been diagnosed, the fact is that anxiety and fear and stress is something that we all experience. You know, sleeplessness, just our inability, isolation. They were saying that how loneliness is just another thing that most people struggle with in today's times. So we see that all in all, and it's in fact, one could even say that it is easier for us to tolerate bodily inconveniences, but it's actually much more difficult to tolerate difficulties that we experience at the level of the mind. And most of all, the mind is actually something that decides our destiny. It's not just that we are experiencing mental challenges and so hence, but the fact is that, one of the other aspects of its godlike power is that the mind is actually the driver.
Yeah, what's in the mind is the future body actually. The mind is the index of the future body. So depending on how our mind is doing, that's the kind of, or thinking or desiring, that's the kind of body we will get, even in this life and in the future life. So we have to, I guess, try to understand. Krishna is saying that understand the mind, and by understanding the mind we can make it our friend. If you don't understand the mind or try to control the mind or manage the mind in the wrong way, then it can become our worst enemy. So we'll look into what the mind is, what the Bhagavad-Gita says mind is, and what's the anatomy or physiology of the mind, and how does it connect to the body, how does it connect to the senses. So all those kind of details will go into, as Krishna talks about in the Bhagavad-Gita. So this is something that we already talked about in the second chapter, but again coming back to the point of mind, that this is how our body is structured. We have the physical body made of earth, water, fire, air and ether, and inside that is the subtle body, which is, you can call it mind, or sometimes Bhagavad-Gita also calls it the mind, intelligence and false ego, but they are all in the subtle realm, and it's kind of all one, but depending on the function it's divided into three: mind, intelligence and false ego. And then and covered by these two bodies is ourselves, which is the soul, which is the spirit soul, covered by these two. And this is how it is structured, and in the next slide we'll look at how the mind works and what it does.
Actually, all of these elements, the 5 gross elements and as well as the 3 subtle elements, these are all separate material energy, right? So they are distinct. And of course the subtle body, you could say, and this is a little bit getting into the deep end of it, but you could just say that it's the mind and it's divided according to functionality into intelligence and false ego. But in actuality it is the one mind which is being projected, which is basically the soul projecting itself. So let's go here first. 1 second, I'm just gonna can you go back? Let me put this away. No, not this. I'm sorry.
This one?
No. Go back. Keep going back. Yeah. Go ahead.
So this is the Upanishad. Katha Upanishad describes this relationship further between the mind, the body and the senses, and the Atman or the soul. So the mind has the senses are being driven by the mind actually, or the mind has the opportunity to control the senses, but at the same time the senses are providing all the inputs to the mind. So there is a kind of interconnection both ways, two-way traffic between the mind and the senses. But in this example, the mind is the reins connecting the horses, and through the mind the horses can be driven in a certain direction. But at the same time the horses are also pulling, or the senses are also pulling the mind in different directions.
And then the charioteer here is the buddhi, or the intelligence, which has the power to actually control the mind, right? And then finally there is the Atman, or the consciousness, who's sitting on this chariot sort of in a half asleep condition and has given the power of attorney to the mind. So basically the mind has received its godlike power from the original source, which is the Atman, and has kind of taken over and is driving this chariot, which is compared to our body, in whatever direction it wants to take it. And so as you can imagine if the senses are not under control, and if the mind is, if the reins are not held properly, and if the intelligence also goes off to sleep, right, or is just simply dragged by these 5 horses, then the chariot will just basically be dragged by the senses. And we see that as a big reason why so many of us struggle with our senses, our mind, and our intelligence, and the soul is happily sleeping away. So should we watch this?
Yeah, so this is kind of describes the mystery of the mind and the subtle body.
We've already explained it, but I thought it would be nice to watch the graphics. Can we go on?
The subtle body. That part of our intellectuals. 1. The mind, a repository of past experiences. 2. The intelligence, that part of our intellectual self, responsible for making decisions on the basis of gain and loss. And 3. The false ego, which is our sense of being the body and not the soul. The subtle body, like the gross body, is material and temporary. The subtle body is the medium through which the soul interacts with the gross body and the world outside. The soul is conscious, whereas the subtle body, being material, is not. The subtle body is just another filter through which consciousness, the soul, interacts with the world. And that filter is quite refined. The subtle body, just like the gross body, has senses, subtle senses.
So that's an interesting
point.
point.
The gross body has, for example, 2 eyes, a physical mechanism through which it picks up visual information. The subtle body also has subtle eyes, through which it also picks up visual information. Just as the gross body has ears, the subtle body has subtle ears. Just as the gross body has a nose, the subtle body has a subtle nose, and so on. To help us better understand the relationship between the gross body, the subtle body, and the soul, the Vedic library provides an intriguing metaphor found in the Katha Upanishad 1.3.3 to 4.
I think we already discussed
The
this.
soul is the passenger in the chariot of the material body, and intelligence is the charioteer. The mind is the reins, and the senses are the horses. The self is thus the enjoyer or sufferer in the association of the mind and senses. So it is understood by great thinkers.
So as we can see, it kind of explains it a little bit more visually, what we just described about the chariot and the chariot driver. And I guess the interesting point that we're going to talk a little bit more about is how there are subtle senses also. And those are all described in the Sankhya philosophy, described in the Srimad Bhagavatam.
So like like we have a gross sense, say for example, for the gross sense for seeing is eyes. That is a gross sense that pertains to the body. But the mind has the subtle sense for seeing, which is a sense of sight, that is actually located inside the mind. And the whatever we perceive through our eyes is dependent on that sense of sight within the mind to process it, and actually for the mind to create that reality, which is then further reflected on the soul. So that way we can see how the Bhagavad-Gita goes into greater depth about this relationship of what the mind is and how it interacts with the body. So this is another example, which is the computer hardware software example. We can think of the body as the hardware, computer hardware, the hard drive and the display and the processor and everything. And the user is the soul, the person who's sitting at the computer, and the software, the operating system and any other applications that you load on the operating system is the mind. And the different applications that you load, video games or Word or whatever, those are like the different desires and the vrittis of the mind. So you need, in order to run the hardware, you actually need the operating system. If your operating system crashes, then your hardware is useless. Similarly, for subtle body, kind of crashes, then we can't really use none of the senses will work actually. Although we may have eyes and ears and everything else is there, but if the mind is gone, then none of the senses will work. So the body becomes useless. So this is another way to look at the relationship with the body, mind, and the soul.
Okay. And then this is another example that is actually a really nice example about the mind and consciousness or soul. So the soul is actually compared to a fire. And so fire means it's illuminating, and it gives light, right? And the consciousness is self-illuminating. But when the fire or the flame is covered by smoke, then the fire is not visible, and all you see is the smoke. And so the smoke is actually compared to the mind, and the fire is compared to the pure consciousness. And so right now our consciousness is covered over by the smoke of mind, and so the mind is sort of interrupting or preventing us from seeing who we truly are. So it's acting as sort of like a screen, right, through which we can't really see our own real nature. But the fire is always there, and the reason why the smoke is there, it's actually dependent on the existence of fire. So there can never be, there can be no fire, there can be no smoke without a fire, right? So there is fire. The reason why there is smoke is because there is some fire there. So the mind actually gets its power from the original source, which is the soul.
The mind is not conscious by itself. It gets its power of being almost conscious from the soul.
Just like, like right now we may be speaking through a microphone, and somebody might be hearing it through a speaker, and it seems like the speaker is speaking, but the reality is that if there is no power, if it's not connected to the power, then it's just a dead piece of metal which cannot really transmit anything. But while it is plugged in, to that extent it appears that it is, it's creating some sound. And if a child who does not understand the mechanics looks at it, he may think that, oh, actually the sound is coming out of this. So in the same way, the mind is also, it appears that the mind is animated, and we are thinking and we are feeling and doing so many activities with the mind, but only because it's connected to the power, which is the soul. And so the soul is actually, being carried actually by this mind. So I don't know, Vishka can continue a little bit more maybe.
Yeah, so this is the way the mind works, and so now we talked about the relationship between the mind and the senses, how the senses, they through the sense organs, they send a signal to the mind, and that signal is received by the subtle sense inside the mind. So the mind has a subtle sense for sight, the mind has a subtle sense for hearing, touch, and so on and so forth. So those signals are received by that subtle sense in the mind, and then combining all of them, then the mind will create like a reality which is beyond three-dimensional. Actually, it is because there's so many the emotional dimension also comes in, the physical, the spiritual, whatever, all the different dimensions come into that, and the mind creates that reality.
Actually, they say, right, that we never really see a flower or whatever we are seeing. We don't see it out there. We actually see it in here. So another thing we say is that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are.
As we are.
So we, whatever reality that we are perceiving out there actually exists within our mind.
It is said that like we see a flower in a certain way, right? We see the color, and then we perceive the reality of the flower in a certain way. But there is a saying in Hindi, like "Sawan ke andeko, hara hi hara." Like a person who goes blind during the rainy season, he sees everything green, because that's the last impression of the world he had. Everything was green. So whereas a rat or a cat or some other animal may look at the flower in a different way, because they are perceiving they are getting the sensory input at a different frequency, and they may only smell. They may not be able to see the colors of the flower, but they may be able to smell the flower in a much more magnified way. So their sense of that flower is completely different. So their reality of that same flower is different.
So this is actually, different scientists, talking about, is it possible that we live in a world of simulation?
Part of a giant simulation. The
question of whether we are living in a simulation is more related to something more narrow. That is this computer program that we're living in intentionally created, or is it just a natural occurrence?
Seems to me it's a hard question to resolve, because it's easy to imagine a game designer, a simulation designer, making it so sophisticated that you can't tell.
So there is this argument that, for instance, Elon Musk made, that we can build game consoles that create virtual worlds that look a lot like simulations to us of this universe, and that can be so realistic that we cannot really distinguish them. And this argument is to me that every civilization that has sufficient technical capabilities is going to build many of these game consoles. So the probability that when you look around and you find yourself in a pretty realistic looking world, that you're actually in a simulation is much higher than the probability that you are in base reality. But I think what this doesn't take into account is the level of detail that you can achieve in such a simulation.
In the simulation hypothesis, right, there's some programmer at a lower level that has created.
So the question is, this mind is creating a simulation for us, a version of the reality, and are we all living in this simulation? Where are we actually living?
And this is something that the Bhagavatam speaks about, right? That what is reality, and what we are perceiving as real, is it real, or is it something that we are projecting? So let's see.
Simulation.
So this is a good, maybe we'll pause here. So, the mind, as we described, actually can act as a window, or it can act as a screen. So when it acts as a window, then we can understand that the mind is in a place of goodness and can actually see clearly. So window, an ideal window, is one where there is no dust, and it's the panes are clean, and then you can actually see outside with clarity. But sometimes the mind can also act as a screen.
So before we go into the screen, the other way to look at the mind as a window is that, say, if you are sitting in a room which has windows in all four directions, right? And depending on which window is open, you can only see through that window, right? If only one window is open, then what you are seeing, the outside world is only what you see through that window, and that's what the world is for you. If some other window opens, then when you look at the window, maybe there is a river there, right? So you see the river. On the other window, there is maybe a forest there, so you see the forest, and for you that's the only window that is open. So similarly, mind is like that. It's continuously fluctuating, and in different windows it opens through which what we perceive as the reality of the world.
But then sometimes the mind also can become a screen, right? So the screen, meaning that, what is a screen? A screen is simply like a white fabric on which we are projecting a movie, right? And so what are we watching? So we are sitting within, and we are simply watching the movie that the mind is showing to us or projecting to us. And so if it's a horror movie, we sit there and we watch in horror, and we all have experience of that. The mind keeps cooking and creating these scenarios and what ifs, and what about this and what about that, and and he said this and she said this, and this is just like a movie that the mind keeps playing over and over and over and over again. And so so our reality, or our experience, our narratives that we have within us, these are all movie narratives that the mind has created for us, and we are experiencing it on an ongoing basis. And so the Bhagavad-Gita is basically saying that there is that giving us an insight that there is a way for us to reclaim our original power and take away that sort of this projected world that we are living in, and try to live in a world which is the reality. So
I mean, the other way to look at the screen, so we talked about the interaction between the mind and the senses, and this watching the screen analogy kind of shows the relationship between mind and the soul. So the mind gets all the input from the senses, and it creates a simulation or the picture for the soul to see. Now the soul has two options. It can be focused on its own spiritual senses and receiving the input from that, and that's when the soul is in the spiritual realm. But when the soul enters the material realm, then because the mind is showing it some picture, then the soul can choose to look at that picture and be absorbed in that reality. And when it gets absorbed in that reality, then it basically gets tied down to that's the simulation on the screen of the mind. and that's how the soul perceives that, okay, I am a man, I am a woman, I am this, I am that, all the different dualities, all the false realities that it imposes, identities imposes, because it's focusing its attention. As soon as it removes its attention from the simulation on the mind, then it can perceive itself as the spiritual being.
I was just remembering this verse from the 2nd chapter of the Bhagavad-Gita, where Krishna says that all of these experiences are simply because of sense perception, and one must learn to tolerate them. So when one understands, that the experience that we are, that we are going through is simply because of two reasons. One is because just the senses coming in touch with the objects of the senses, and also because the mind taking those perceptions and creating a story around it. And that is the reason why two people may go through exactly the same experience, but their experience of it might be completely different. And their response to it, of course, that's a whole other story, but even their experience of that situation may be completely different. And so what's going on there? And so what's really going on there is that, their mind is playing a different movie, So maybe we'll pause here, and I think you wanted to read a purport, right?
Yeah.
And then we can discuss. Let's see.
Let's read the purport and then you can talk.
Okay. Very lot of discussions, as we can see. This is you can just read it.
Yeah, we're reading from the Bhagavad-Gita. I don't know. Let me just share it. Otherwise, this is the 5th verse. Uddhared Atmanam Atma. The word Atma appears so many times here. The word Atma denotes body, mind, and soul. That's very interesting, depending upon different circumstances. So the word Atma can mean mind, it can mean body, or it can mean soul. In the yoga system, the mind and the conditioned soul are especially important. Since the mind is the central point of yoga practice, Atma refers here to the mind. The purpose of the yoga system is to control the mind and draw it away from attachment to sense objects. It is stressed herein that the mind must be so trained that it can deliver the conditioned soul from the mire of nescience. In material existence, one is subjected to the influence of the mind and the senses.
In fact, the pure soul is entangled in the material world because the mind is involved with the false ego, which desires to lord it over material nature. Therefore, the mind should be trained so that it will not be attracted by the glitter of material nature, and in this way the conditioned soul may be saved. One should not degrade oneself by attraction to sense objects. The more one is attracted by sense objects, the more one becomes entangled in material existence. The best way to disentangle oneself is to always engage the mind in Krishna consciousness. So we can pause here and take your reflections, your questions. I think Naji had a thought. Mind is that which connects the self to the world. Every time you predicate some worldly quality to the self, the mind is the mediator of that connection.
That's very true.
Yeah. Peace of mind. Is it better to master the senses first with the mind, or is it better to master the mind with purified intelligence and then master the senses? Such a good question.
We'll address that in our second part of our presentation, which talks about how to basically master the mind.
But essentially, the mind is considered to be the general of the senses. So he's like, the mind is also sometimes called the sixth sense. And so there are 5 senses, but the mind is the 6th sense. So there is a sort of feedback loop between the senses and the mind, and we'll talk about that. Is the video talking about the mind or the physical brain? So this is again another really confusing thing for people. That is the mind and the brain the same? And even in our Ayurvedic studies, it is described in our books that how the brain is sort of like the office of the mind, and the brain is not the mind. The brain is simply the physical instrument through which the mind functions. And there are, I think we've shared this video before about how even when some people are declared brain dead, they're still able to see and experience things. So meaning that maybe there is something that survives even the death of a brain, and that kind of confirms with what the Bhagavad-Gita is saying, that the mind is actually a higher reality than the brain. And so, a lot of psychiatry and a lot of like the studies, they try to find out what's going on in the brain, but that does not take the full picture in account, because there is something very subtle which is driving the brain.
I mean, the mind may be like, for example, they may say that the receptor for the sight is like way back in the brain, and receptor for hearing is here, and receptor for touch is here. So that is all right. All the different receptors, the physical receptors for all these senses may be in the brain, but then that is just the entry point of the signal, and then from there there is a mystical connection between that, and the mind is not there in the brain. The mind is covering the soul. The soul is in the heart region, the heart chakra. So that's where the soul is, and that's where the covering of the soul is also there. The mind, intelligence, and false ego is all covering the soul. It's not here in the mind here, physical brain here. So somehow that mystical connection between that mind and the sense receptors in the brain, it happens by the whole apparatus of this body is being run by the super soul. Actually, he's the master engineer who is running this whole body, and we have no clue how this body is run. Right? We have no clue. So the soul is basically helplessly just sitting there, and then the super soul is running the show. And the mind body connection, the mind soul connection, and all those complicated connections are being run by the super soul, and we just kind of go for the ride, good or bad.
Deidre, wouldn't we be a soul with a body and a mind? Absolutely right. That's ultimately the real understanding, that we are soul who is inhabiting a body, and that we're inhabiting two kinds of body: the physical, the gross body, and then the subtle body, which is the mind.
And the interesting thing is that when we talk about the mind and the senses, it may seem like the soul doesn't have a mind, or the soul doesn't have intelligence, or the soul doesn't have senses. That is not true, because we also know that whatever is there in the material world is a reflection of what is there in the spiritual world. So since we have mind and we have senses, right, and intelligence and everything, so the soul must have a mind and intelligence and senses. So the spirit soul has all those functions. The soul, like Krsna, is not mindless, and then we see so many things happening in the spiritual realm. So everything is super intelligent, everything is mindful, everything is full of emotions, everything is there. It's just that the soul has the spiritual mind, the soul has spiritual intelligence, soul has spiritual senses, everything is there. But here it's all covered, so we only experience the shadow.
This, I concur, this resonates. The isolation, loneliness for some generation is the lack of true one-on-one, in-person communication versus texting and tech. But for younger generations, I've read that the isolation is tempered by social media and tech. Absolutely. It's, I was talking to our son also, that how so many of the habits, we worry about mental health and all that, and we see such an increase. And it is connected to, just like you have good physical hygiene that keeps the body in a state of good health. In the same way, Ayurveda talks about good mental hygiene that can actually keep our mental health in a good place. And it's also has a connection with the soul, with our consciousness, but it also has a connection with the body as well. And we're learning more and more about it, what kind of gut bacteria we have. So there's just so many factors that play into keeping our mental health in a good place. And of course, the whole discussion about mantra, which we'll talk about, spiritual practices that can really uplift the mind. And so this is the knowledge that is really needed, as we can see how many people are struggling with mental health challenges, but at the same time, it's knowledge that as people find out more and more. I remember when we went to drop our son to college, and we went to the student services, right? Counseling, the student counseling center. And we just we met the director, and we asked her, it's like, okay, what would be one tip or one suggestion that you would give for a student coming in so that he or she could really integrate well and do well in college? And her response was meditation. That was her first thing, followed by sleep and other things. So more and more people are recognizing the need for having some spiritual practices that can keep us in a mentally happy place. Go ahead. So isn't we are all
like colorblind people?
No, there is. Oh, acha, okay, yeah.
What real color is the flower? Whatever. Yeah, I mean, this whole every material object has some primary qualities and some secondary qualities. I think there is a term for that, Naji, you might know, like qualities like color and things like that.
Exactly. Primary and secondary qualities. Yeah.
I think it's called qualia or something. The secondary qualities, and they are subtle. like for example, color is a subtle quality. It's perceived only in the mind. It's not perceived in, indirectly like that. So but anyways, that can change for depending on where the state of the mind is.
Didn't we discuss this, that there really is no objectivity? At the time we discussed these thought processes are beyond logic. This just popped into my mind. Yeah, exactly. It's our perception is like you discussed about how this window, right? We're seeing such a narrow window, and that is our reality. Isn't we are all thoughts in the mind of God, basically the same theory? I've never, I mean, in a sense, yeah, you could say that we are part and parcel, and we are emanations, right?
Yeah, we are energy of God.
We are
I mean,
energy.
That's I guess another way to look at it. Everything is an energy of God. So, and everything is possible by God's thinking.
Just like we talked about the flame and the smoke, right? So the smoke would be the mind, but the flame would be the supreme consciousness, and we would be a spark of that flame. So, yeah. So one-sided view, we can only perceive a small percentage of reality or the world, as opposed to the entire compass view, being clear and open. This can depend the mindset of an individual and where a person is. Yeah, exactly. I think the mind is to brain as sight is to eyes.
Yes.
Very nice.
That's your SAT question?
Is it myth or fact that we use only 1% of our mind? We don't use its full potential.
That is true. Many people say that we only use a very small percentage of our mind.
And also, here is the other thing. We were, and we'll talk more about this, that in a day, there is some, controversy around that. How many thoughts do we have in a day? But it's a lot, like some people say it's like 50,000 or 40,000. The numbers vary, but the idea being that it's a lot of thoughts every day, and then you multiply that by your 1 year and then your full lifetime. It's like so many thoughts. And then even more interesting is what we perceive as the conscious self is just, again, a very small part of all that stuff that goes on beneath the conscious self. So much that we are not even aware of. So what we are dealing here with is not something that is, and Krishna says that this mind is not easy to overcome. And so when he says that, it's impossible. So, but there is a way, and then we'll talk about that. And then the brain-gut connection. Yeah. So thank you. I think this is kind of, we'll continue.
If anybody else has any points, like Zuma, Suvarna, Sindhu and Raghu, if you guys have any points, Eric, Anshul and Anchita.
I think
you guys.
I'm
Yes.
sorry.
Go ahead, Juma.
Yeah, I think I'll get my answers once we more progress ahead. But I always feel that why do we have so much of mental health issues, now vis-a-vis, in our parents' time, and we are more open to so much of spiritual realm as compared to them. Like I've seen my mom. I'll frequently visit temples, and she's like, "Why do you have to visit so many times temple? Home is a temple and everything." And they didn't have so much of opening. Like for me, I'm so lucky that I'm doing a Bhagavad-Gita session with you, but they never had it, and yet there was so less of mental health issues. That's all. But I guess I'm going to go, when we go more deeper into this subject, I'll get my answers. But that's something I always keep wondering.
It's a good.
Yeah, I mean, in today's day and age, the modes of passion and ignorance, they have intensified, and as a result, the problems of the mind have also grown. In like 20-30 years ago, those modes were not that strong compared to now.
I think Delia, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to ask if you are feeling better after yesterday.
Yes, we are. We definitely are, I think we just had some, because the day before that was a festival day, so it was just it was a lot. So I'm doing much better. Thank you.
And the food for thought in the mind, I think, makes you feel better.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think this mind is very interesting, even as we are, delving deep into it. It's amazing, And, so even when we are chanting, it's really what we're trying to do is trying to control, you know, and I like that a lot, Deidre. The Western world is a mess. A monster has been created in our lifestyle. Absolutely. I think that's kind of, Juma, one way to look at it, that, you know, the older times, you know, life was, you know, lived on dharmic principles, and it is described that, you know, living a life in dharma protects you. So even though, you know, at one level you could say that they were not really, you know, they didn't really have very strong practices, but it was just their lifestyle, you know, so much in sync with nature.